My name is Chris Martin. Thanks so much for joining us. I am the Interim Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. And on behalf of our colleagues and collaborators at Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute and the Kyiv School of Economics, I want to welcome you to the second session of Kyiv Connection, which is a four-part webinar series devoted to featuring compelling and contemporary conversations about Ukraine. Each event will feature a Ukrainian scholar in dialogue with an international colleague, featuring interdisciplinary conversations rooted in a Ukrainian perspective. Today's webinar is entitled War Through Historians' Eyes and features two excellent local historians. We have Dr. Serhii Plokhii, who is the Mykhailo Hrushevs'kyi Professor of Ukrainian History and Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute here at Harvard. A leading authority on the region, he has published extensively in English, Ukrainian, and Russian. He is the author of numerous books, including The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Frontline, Essays on Ukraine's Past and Present, The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine, and Yalta, The Price of Peace. In dialogue today with Serhii, we have Professor Chris Miller, who is the Professor of International History at Tufts University, where his research focuses on technology, geopolitics, economics, international affairs, and Russia. He's the author of 3 books on Russia, including Putinomics, Power and Money and Resurgent Russia, We Shall Be Masters, Russia's Pivots to the East Asia, from Peter the Great to Putin, and The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, Mikhail Gorbachev and the Collapse of the USSR. His most recent book is the award-winning Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology, and it's a geopolitical history of the computer chip. So thank you so much for joining us today. Please do note that we are recording this conversation. It will be available on YouTube. And if you have any questions for our faculty here today, please enter them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end of the talk. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Serhii, with our thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the Davis Center for organizing this event. It's wonderful to have Cristopher Miller with us. Chris, welcome. This is my second attempt, I guess, to convert you to the Ukrainian cause. The first time it was when you took my course on the frontiers of Europe. And I asked you back then, why did you take the course? And if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned that as a student in school, you watched events of the Orange Revolution and Yulia Tymoshenko in particular. So I just did the math. It was a long time ago, 20 plus years ago, but certainly those events are related. I really look forward to our conversation because you are a historian who studies the region and also global history without particular focus on Ukraine. And it is, for me, and I hope for the audience as a whole, is really very, very interesting to hear what people from outside of the field think about this war and think about that war as a historians from a historical perspective. Because this war, if you talk about the most immediate, its incarnation, the all-out war and the all-out invasion against Ukraine started roughly half a year after the publication by Vladimir Putin of the essay on the historical unity of Russia and Ukraine. So history and misuse of history are an important part of that, of the war story from the start go. But that's something that received relatively a lot, or at least a significant number of attention. But there are other aspects of the war beyond that I think really can be better understood. Our expectations regarding the future peace can be also probably more informed and more reasonable when we look at the war through the prism of history and history as a whole, not just history of the region, but region as well. And that's basically why I'm so excited about this conversation. And with the way how we'll structure it, I will ask you questions, and then from time to time, maybe we'll comment on that or maybe make them more specific. But the first question that I want to ask you would really deal more with your work, your recent book, Chip Wars, than with your previous ones, and I just have some of them here. This is exceptionally very, very, very good book that I certainly learned a lot about. This is another one about the Russia in the Far East and in Central Asia. But the book that my question is related to is Chip Wars. It's about technology, and I will start with the question of, as a historian of technology, what do you see in this war between Russia and Ukraine? What is familiar, where history rhymes, and what is new and maybe unexpected?
Well, first off, thank you for the opportunity to join today. Excited for this conversation. It's certainly an important point in the war. I think when you look at it technologically, you see two things that coexist uncomfortably. I think the first is the persistence of types of warfare that would have looked familiar to soldiers in World War I. Trenches being dug, attritional conflict with front lines in certain places moving forwards or backwards by just a couple of feet each day. The centrality of artillery fire, the role of infantry in pushing forward and pulling back, taking substantial casualties in the process. I think all of this is pretty familiar. It's been familiar not just for years, but really for decades. And a lot of the war has been exactly this type of conflict. And I think this has coexisted next to something that's really quite new, which is high-tech warfare of the type that we've seen to some degree in recent conflicts. But most of the recent conflicts where we've seen it have been one-sided, with the US, for example, having all the technological advantages and its adversaries in places like Iraq or Afghanistan fighting not with technological advantages, but with the opposite. And if you look at the use of drones, for example, the centrality of space-based intelligence and communications, the use of Starlink on the Ukrainian side, the centrality of electronic warfare and jamming, all of this is very modern technology, relying on digital capabilities, where both sides are in a lot of ways pushing the frontiers of capabilities, and they have been evolving rapidly over the course of the now 3 years of warfare. And in some ways, it shouldn't surprise us. You have old and new coexisting. That's often, I think, the case in war, but it's made it challenging to draw lessons or conclusions about the role of technology, since we've simultaneously had very old traditional means of combat coinciding with this more technologically enabled type of fighting.
Well, thank you. You mentioned that certain things are familiar and really going back not just to World War II, but to World War One, sort of trench warfare. But I, as a historian, also thought that I recognize a lot of things really coming from World War II, and in particular, I think I better understand now how the Red Army fought the war back in 1941 to 1945. And that comes from looking at what is happening, what was happening in the past with this so-called mid assaults that were conducted first know-how by Prigozhin group, and now it became something that was adopted by the rest of the Russian army. And I recognize certain things, but then I asked myself in terms of how these things can be transformed and transmitted. There are generations between the soldiers who were fighting in World War II and then the Russian soldiers who are fighting today. And to a degree, what is happening on the Ukrainian side, if you think about institutions and if you think about the Soviet army, it looks like it's one and the same. So I wonder, what are the mechanisms in which the countries continue to fight the wars in more or less the same manner over decades or over centuries?
You know, I think there is certainly a story of institutional memory persisting over generations of military personnel, both in terms of the specific curricula and training, but also in terms of the historical case studies that people are educated and trained to think about, and they're drawing from when they're making decisions. on the battlefield. And I think that certainly has impacted both the Russian and Ukrainian sides. I would posit probably the Russian side slightly more, just because there was more of an institutional breakage in the Ukrainian military after 2014, whereas that wasn't the case on the Russian side. I think the other dynamic, though, is that some of the decisions that one makes are structural rather than driven by institutions. And so if you ask yourself, why was it that the Soviets suffered so substantial a casualty rate in World War II? I think the answer is partly about institutions and practices, but also partly about they were constrained in terms of their equipment. They didn't have nearly as much mechanization as either the Germans did or the other players in the war, like the British or the Americans. And so they had to substitute equipment for personnel. And that was the trade-off that was made repeatedly, I think, by the Red Army in 1945. And if you look at Prigozhin's decision-making, I think in 2022 and 2023, I think there was a similar dynamic at play. If there was a deficit of high-quality equipment, you would supplement by labor. And I think especially on the Russian side, I think where there was a realization early on that actually casualty counts didn't matter that much. It didn't matter politically. There's been no backlash in Russia, that you could sustain pretty high casualties without really having to change your operational concepts. I think that's been different in Ukraine, where there is more sensitivity to the loss of life in the war. But on the Russian side, I think the combination of the historical memory, which you allude to, plus the lack of constraints around casualties, combined with the reality that they don't have all the equipment they need and so have to substitute for personnel, explains the meat grinder dynamics that you referenced.
Yes, thank you. I didn't think about this in those terms. I think it is very important. You mentioned another thing that I didn't really focus in my own thinking about the war, and that this time around, this is the war of, when it comes to technology, to a degree, equals, right? So there is a lot in this war that comes from the 19th century in terms of ideology, and we'll talk about that, about imperialism, comparisons about colonial war. But the difference is that the colonial war, exactly as you described, that they are fought. They're fought in different environment. Then there would be stingers appearing in Afghanistan, and suddenly changing the dynamic. But here it's still different. A lot of drone production is Ukrainian production. A lot of people who operate those drones, and includes, it looks like that with all the setbacks in the war, Ukraine now is on par and maybe even winning the drones war. So where, in terms of looking at the human capital in this war, whether you have any observations, because if on the one hand there are Prigozhin group, on the other hand there are IT people who are either mobilized or decided to go on their own and fight this war, whether there is anything that you maybe see as a historian comparing that to other wars, hot wars, or maybe Cold War.
It's a really interesting question about human capital. And I think human capital in the military context takes on a different meaning than in most other segments of society or economy. The experience you use in a military context is experience not exclusively, but often largely gleaned from prior military activity. And so I think in some ways, in significant ways, probably the Ukrainian armed forces have been strengthened by the fact that since 2014, they've been involved in at least low-level conflict on a regular basis from then until 2022. So there was human capital built up there. But I think on the Russian side, because their military had been more active in expeditionary ways in Georgia, in Syria, as well as against Ukraine, they'd actually built up more human capital for military purposes than we probably realized. And I think the first couple of weeks of the war, we saw the Russian military operating in its least capable fashion. And then after that point, there was learning, both from the mistakes of the first couple of weeks of the war and from their other operations that have led them to become more effective over time. And so from a pure military to military side, I actually think that the activities of the Russian military over the past now 20 years have started to build up human capital that they've learned eventually to deploy on the battlefield here. And here you can draw lines from Syria to the Russia-Ukraine war, or even from Georgia to the Russia-Ukraine war, which I think looked like lines you wouldn't have drawn had you been taking a snapshot in March of 2022. But now, 3 years in, it does seem like there are indeed lessons learned, and the use of Wagner forces is certainly one of them. A clear lesson learned from Syria to the Russia-Ukraine war. But I think your question more broadly about human capital across society and the warfare and the war is quite interesting. On both sides, to differing degrees, we've seen efforts to attract both funding and equipment and support from society, especially in the drone context, where I think both militaries, their institutions were slower than society to realize their importance. But I also think we see the fact that, I think to generalize, but I think it's a fair generalization, Russian society was more top down and hierarchical, where Ukrainian has been more bottom up. We've seen more rapid adjustment on the Ukrainian side, precisely because there's social structures that enable that bubbling up from the bottom in terms of new ideas and new concepts for using technology. And so I guess my sense would be that there has been more adaptation of technology on the Ukrainian side than on the Russian side, both because of necessity, but also because you do have social structures that enable that transfer of ideas more freely and more openly than you do in Russia.
Thank you. So one thing that is very clear after 3 years of large-scale war is that the drones are in. Any future war and continuation of this war really depends on drones. Does this mean that tanks are out and the ships are, if not completely out, then probably less reliable than they used to be, because Ukraine demonstrated this victory on the Black Sea without having a navy of its own? Of course, you can count now maybe sea drones as part of Navy. That's changes our calculus and our thinking. So drones are in. What is out?
Well, I think drones are in. I think also satellites are in a big way. The centrality of satellite communications and intelligence to Ukraine's successes is really quite important. And these are largely Ukraine leveraging Western and US, both commercial and military intelligence satellite capabilities. I would also say air defense is also in a big way, both on the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. A lot of evolution of air defense capabilities in response to the drones. What's out? I think certainly in the naval conflict in the Black Sea has illustrated the risks of large ships, both to small drones and also to traditional anti-ship missiles. Now, could you argue the Russians were shockingly unprepared for the types of capabilities that Ukraine developed? And had they been better prepared, they might have been able to use their Navy in a more capable way. Perhaps there's operational concepts that, had they been different, would have enabled the Russian Navy to be more of a significant player. But I think you're right to say that the ability of a low-cost missile to take out a high-cost ship is a lesson of this conflict. For tanks, I'm less confident of that. It seems to me that both sides are eager to get their hands on larger numbers of more advanced tanks. That armor is still important. It doesn't solve all of your problems, but it does defend you against a fair amount. And the fact that both sides are trying to acquire more makes me think that they're not fully out. I think many of the other types of equipment that militaries have been purchasing for the past several decades are still in. Artillery is still in, both of the traditional sort and rocket and missile artillery. Certainly that's been a key lesson of the war, and one of the challenges that the West has faced is building up the supply of the actual munitions that are needed to put in those artillery pieces. So some things are out, but I think a lot more has actually been re-emphasized as an important part of modern warfare.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. This war is being fought with a lot of equipment that stayed there since the time of the Cold War. And that reminded me about an argument that I don't know whether I share it or not, but an argument that the revolutionary wars and civil war in Russia in particular was fought very much by cavalry, given the amount of the people who were trained in cavalry and the amount of horses that were available. So the war itself, in that sense, was really belonged to the past. But given that those were the resources, human resources and animal resources and training that were available, that was what was happening. Let me transition now, maybe from technology to economy. And again, your book, The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, is about economy and political economy and geopolitics around it. Today in Ukraine, and probably not only in Ukraine, the biggest hope for ending the war is associated with the idea that the Russian economy probably would not be able to function in an effective way, the way how it functions today. It is overheated. It is all focused on that military production. And then the economists to whom I talked all agree more or less on that. And then the question is how long that can go and how long can it last. And I will start with very broad question: to what degree wars or economies and strong economies are important in historically, but also in this world where Ukraine is fighting on the strength not of just of its own economy, but also European economy and American economy as well.
Well, I think maybe to start on the Ukrainian side, what we've had is a paradox over the last 3 years, whereby, as you say, Ukraine has been able to access many of the capabilities of the broader Western defense industrial base, US and European. And if you looked simply at GDP figures, you would find that the US plus Europe is, depending on how you calculate, 15 times the size of the economy of Russia. And yet at points in the war, Russia was producing more artillery shells, for example, than the rest of the West combined, despite their advantage in pure economic terms. And so there is a gap in terms of the pre-existing militarization of the Western economies versus the Russian economy. Russia had always kept its defense spending higher. It always had prepared more for a mobilization scenario like we've seen over the past couple of years. It kept a much larger share of its Soviet era equipment in stockpile, and it's been drawing down on those stockpiles since the war started. And so I think it's critical that we recognize that although there is a relationship in the long run between GDP and military power, that relationship is only in the long run, and it depends on the specific policies you put in place to generate military power from GDP. And I think in Europe in particular, but really across the West, we've seen over the last several decades a willingness to see military power atrophy relative to what you think it would be as a share of GDP, which is why Russia has been able, on the back of a much smaller economy, to present a broad threat, not just to Ukraine, of course, but to the rest of the West over the past couple of years. And I think that explains part of the reason why there's been some hope in Ukraine and in the West for Russia's economy to be the weak link in this war. And thus far, it has not really happened for a couple of reasons. I think first is that Russia started the war prepared in an economic sense for conflict. It had a very low level of government debt. It had large savings funds that the government could draw on and have these stockpiles of military equipment. It could draw down. So in comparison to the rest of the West, the Russians were economically prepared for war in a way that no one else really was. So that gave them more space during the conflict, whereby they could ramp up their production and sustain the war without really experiencing the cost of the war, at least at first. And the second dynamic that is critical to to note is that the Russians, by essentially creative accounting, have been able to hide a lot of the cost of the war in places where it doesn't look like cost. So, for example, we see the Russian defense industrial base borrowing money at larger rates. In theory, those loans will be repaid. And if they are repaid, no one bears the cost of those loans. Now, in reality, the likelihood that those loans gets repaid is low. But until you recognize that those loans won't get repaid, it doesn't look like anyone's actually lost that money yet. And so there's a fair amount of bad debt, bad loans that are sitting on the balance sheets of different banks in Russia and some on the balance sheets of the Russian government that right now looks like a loan that will be repaid, even though in reality it's a cost that has been incurred because the loan will actually be repaid. And you can hide a fair amount of debt in that way, and that's what the Russian government has been doing. It stores up problems for later, but it makes the cost bearable now. The third dynamic is that from the perspective of the typical Russian, based on the data we have access to, their living standards have not declined over the course of the war. And that's because the Russian government has kept its fairly generous social spending going, even as it's ramped up defense spending. And it's also because defense factories have been hiring more, which has been driving up wages. And so thus far, and I think it might change this year, we'll see, but thus far, the typical Russian feels wealthier in terms of the amount of money they have and the things that money can buy than they did before the war. And so long as that's the case, I don't think the Russian government is going to be under intense pressure from an economic perspective to end the war. Now, that can't go on forever, but could it go on for another 12 months? I think it could. And so I don't think we should put a whole lot of faith on the economy to be a real restraining factor in the Kremlin's calculus.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very sobering. Returning to your book on the failure of Soviet economy, and it's of course oversimplification, but still that the Soviet Union lost the Cold War not in a particular battle or in competition because it was producing less nuclear warheads, but the economy played an extremely important role in that story. It was a very different economy, right? There was no elements of market. But if there is anything in the Soviet collapse and economic collapse that can be useful keeping in mind today, thinking either about Russia or Ukraine or the West.
Well, I think there are a lot of similarities, and I think the wartime economy in Russia has moved Russia much more towards a Soviet-style economy now than it was before Russia started the phase of the war in 2022. I think that the sobering takeaway is that the Soviet economy was mismanaged for decades, and it only collapsed in the late 80s and early 90s. And so throughout the 1970s, it would have been accurate to say there are huge inefficiencies in the Soviet economy. Their spending on defense is taking away from investment in the civilian economy. That was accurate for a long time. And so I don't think we should look at the current inefficiencies that are building up, the current misallocation of resources, and conclude that 2025 or 2026 is the end of the road for the Russian economy. Even though I do think it's correct to say, if you look at the state Russia's in now and ask, is Russia going to be more capable in 2035 or less capable as a result of the war? I think the answer is almost certainly less capable because of the extraordinary sums that have been devoted towards the war that could have been devoted to more productive purposes. But that doesn't mean we can ignore what happens between now and that point in the future when the accumulated difficulties do build up, because I think there are lots of problems that Russia can and will cause in the interim. And so simply waiting for the hope for collapse is not, I don't think, a strategy.
Thank you. Let me now maybe combine economy and technology together in my next question. And this is about something that happened last week, that this blow up really in the Oval Office in the White House. The two leaders, President Trump and President Zelensky, were there to sign the rare earth minerals deal. It didn't get much attention. But what is this deal about, not in terms of what went exactly into that document, but in terms of the sort of the world that we are living in? Because for me, and I went to the university, it was back then Soviet Union, we are all forced to read, whether we wanted to do that or not, Lenin's imperialism article as the last stage of the development of capitalism. And the imperialism was about the competition for the minerals and markets. And what I was witnessing in the last couple of weeks and months really reminded me about that. So is this redistribution of the resources that go on now between a competition between new major powers like the US and China and Russia as well? And what are they doing? What they're trying to get, and what that means for the structure of the world in which we live today?
I think the way I would describe this shift has been that over the last 10 years, not in any specific moment, but as a broad trend, there's been a shift away in all of the key economies in the world from looking at trade as a positive sum dynamic to looking at trade as having some positive sum dynamics, but also having some very clear zero sum dynamics. I think that's perhaps most extreme in the realm of minerals, where there are a fair number of minerals where one country, especially in China, in a most pronounced fashion, has control of 90% of the world's processing, and has, we've seen over the last couple of years, imposed a series of limitations on the ability of certain countries to buy certain materials from China. So this is a shift towards a more zero-sum mentality in which I have it and you don't, or you have it and I don't. But it's not only present in minerals. I think it's also been present in manufacturing to a substantial degree. We've seen China acquire a larger share of world manufacturing than any country has had in modern history, a larger share of manufacturing value add than the US plus Japan plus Korea plus Mexico plus Canada combined.
So no comparison to Britain in the 19th century?
Britain in the early industrial revolution would be the only comparison, but over the last 100 years, there's really no comparison, unless you look at the year of like 1945 to 1947 or 8, the immediate post-war period,
which was
aberration,
right.
An aberration.
Yes.
So it really is, unprecedented is not a word that historians like to use, but it is something we haven't seen in the last 150 years in the era of what you'd, I think, describe as modern globalization. And it does, I think, evoke back to some of the zero-sum economics we saw in the late 1930s, when countries were trying to pull some of their neighbors into their trade sphere so that they could also lock out their competitors. And this is something that I think has been slowly gaining ground as a way of thinking in all of the world's key economies. And it's uncomfortable, I think, in a lot of ways, both to business elites who don't want to have constraints on their trade, but also to anyone who was trained to think, as I was as an undergraduate, that trade is fundamentally positive sum. But I think this reality is present, and it's forced a new politicization of the international economy in ways we have not seen for some time.
Thank you. So this is much more than, let's say, competition for access to the uranium ore during World War II or immediately after World War II. Because then, of course, there was the concern that the only uranium ore that was available was in Africa. It seems to me in Kenya or somewhere else, and who would get there first and control, or Belgium, Congo, it seems to me. Yeah. So it is a bigger shift. Is this in terms of minerals themselves, in terms of the deposits? What is your take? This is a story like was with uranium, that we believed that it was only in certain areas of the earth, and then it turned out to be in the in every second backyard. I'm exaggerating, but that every country had a lot of that. This is a temporary concern about controlling the land, or this is something to stay there. And I think it depends on how much we know about what we have under the surface.
So I would phrase it in the following way. I think there's this broader zero-sum thinking around access to minerals that has begun to pervade policymaking. But then even if you start with that frame of thinking, you have to ask, in a specific location, what's the economic value of minerals under the ground? Like, the reality is that in almost every country, there's some quantity of minerals under the ground. And so you ask, what's the ease of extraction and the cost of extraction? And here, I think it's somewhat of a surprise, to me at least, that minerals in Ukraine have come to the fore in the way that they have over the past couple of months. I don't know a lot of people who were keen to mine cobalt or rare earths in Ukraine 10 years ago, presumably because either the deposits that were present were not economically viable or the costs were too high. And so I think that the specific emergence of this is something of a puzzle to me. But I think it does track into this broader re-politicization and this competitive dynamic in terms of access to minerals and access to markets more generally, which is now pervading policymaking.
Thank you. I will make transition to your other book, and that's very much about the Russian thinking, about themselves and their mission toward the East. And I wonder whether this war, as you observe it, for you provided maybe different insights on what you studied, or maybe what you studied helps to understand you better what is happening today in terms of now not of technology, not of economics, but in ideology that probably is and self-perception, which probably is the most important driving force here.
Well, I think one of the arguments that I made in that book is that Russian foreign policy has pivoted between East and West over the course of the last not just several decades, but several centuries. I think over the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian foreign policy has been primarily focused on rebuilding a sphere of control in parts of the regions that were part of the Soviet Union. So we saw that in Georgia. We saw that certainly in the different stages of conflict and war. With Ukraine, we see it with Belarus. And there's been this persistent focus on the rebuilding of the Western Empire. And that's required peace and deep relations with China. And so we've seen an effort to paper over all of the potential differences that one might imagine there could be with China, a settling of border disputes, a series of summits between Xi and Putin that are among the two world leaders that meet the most frequently. They even celebrated their birthdays with each other as a sign of their purported friendship. And I think you could argue that Vladimir Putin is perhaps the most pro-Chinese politician in all of Russia. And I think certainly before the start of the 2022 phase of the war, there was some criticism, quiet, but criticism nonetheless, of the extent to which Putin had tacked close to China in order to be given a freer hand on Russia's Western front. Now, during the current phase of the war, I think it's hard for anyone in Russia to have critical views. But the extent to which there has been a mortgaging of all of Russia's interests in the East to pay the bills on Russia's Western front is, I think, quite striking. And it does seem to me that at some point there will be a pivot back as the pendulum swings. Exactly when that happens, I don't know. I think there are some people in Washington right now who hope that could happen sooner, who believe that you could open up space between Russia and China. I'm not sure that that's right. I think Putin and Xi have both bet so much on their relationship that opening up much space seems hard to imagine with the current leadership in place. But I think one thing you do find historically is that as leaders change, you often have these substantial shifts in Russian foreign policy. And so I wouldn't exclude the possibility that whenever it is that Putin leaves the scene, you could have a swing again in terms of their willingness to offer concessions to the Chinese to get the free hand in the West that they've gotten.
Right. Yes, I certainly agree with that. I don't see any possibility of serious split between Russia and China as long as those two leaders are in office. But historically speaking, and that is part of your book, the Russia-Chinese relations were not great for a long period of time, and even if they were great, back in the 1950s, that period, quote of friendship was limited in time. It was going, maximum for 10 years. And then by the late 1960s, the biggest threat of the nuclear war was coming not from relations between communism and capitalism, but between the two communist countries, between the Soviet Union and China. What is your take on the long term, again going beyond Xi and Putin, relationship between China and Russia? Whether the territorial disputes that were there would pop up at some point and become an important factor in the entire story, the pretty much depopulation of good parts of the Russian Far East, and certainly not as significant growth in China as it used to be, but still there are big numbers of the population. But looking at that not in terms of next 5 years, but next 50 years, where do you see these things developing? And again, the benefit of asking about something that will happen 50 years from now, probably we can say whatever we want. We will not be held responsible for incorrect answers. So every answer is correct.
Well, I think if you look at the last 150 years or 200 years, you find a whole lot of changes in borders between Russia and China, between Russia and Japan, with Korea in Central Asia. And so I think betting on changes in borders over the next 50 years is a pretty safe bet. Exactly where, under what circumstances, I have a harder time predicting. I think the other interesting dynamic right now is how good Russia's relationship is with China relative to how complicated its relations are with nearly every other country in the East Asian region. With Japan, relations are at really historic lows. You have to go back to 1945 when the two countries were actively at war, I think, to find such a complicated period in their relationship. It wasn't a coincidence last year that when Xi Jinping visited Moscow, Kishida, then the Japanese prime minister, visited Kyiv and has repeatedly said what has happened in Ukraine could happen in Asia. So you have an alignment of Japan and Ukraine in a way that I think would have been a surprise to anyone looking at Japanese foreign policy for the last 50 years. Perhaps not a surprise if you looked at Japanese foreign policy in a longer durée, because if you look, of course, pre-1939, you can find some evidence of Japan playing a role in Russia's disputes, or the Soviet Union's disputes in Europe as a means of gaining leverage. But the depths of the relationship in terms of how low it's gone between Russia and Japan is interesting. Same with South Korea, where until recently there was actually a fairly business-like relationship. The Russia-Ukraine war, combined with the deployment of North Korean troops in Russia, has led to a real crisis in relations there. And then one of the other big economies in East Asian region, Taiwan, of course, believes that it has a lot at stake in the outcome of the war as well. So Russia's, I think, at a point where it's uniquely leveraged to its relationship with China at the expense of all of the other key players in East Asia, with the potential exception being North Korea. And of course, there's new substance in the Russia-North Korea relationship, given the deployment of North Korean troops. But of course, everyone knows, including everyone in Moscow, just how transactional North Korea will be. And so I don't think there's much hope in Moscow that North Korea is going to be an enduring ally of any sorts. And so some sort of rebalancing between the reliance on China and the lack of a substantive relationship with Japan and South Korea and others, that also seems like a safe bet over the longer durée. Exactly when, I don't know, but it does seem unsustainable over a decades-long period to have such an imbalance in Russia's relations in East Asia.
Thank you very much. And we are really coming to the end of the time of our conversation before we open floor for Q&A. I will ask my last question, and it will not be about when the war will end and not about how the war will end. But if we assume that the war ends, no matter what the outcome is, for you as a historian, do you see any things that the war changed dramatically, that there will be no return back to the pre-222, or maybe probably 22, let's keep it as a date, for pre-2022 world, no matter what happens in the war, whether you see something that already changed and can't continue in the same way?
Well, my guess would be that the most substantial change would be in Ukraine. You've, of course, written about the nation-building process in Ukraine over the very long durée, but it does seem to me that a war like this in general has a profound impact on any country's national identity, its state and nation-building process. And all that was a process that was well underway before 2022. I would hypothesize that that's probably the most lasting impact of the war, is to further catalyze that sense of nation building in a way that hadn't been fully consolidated perhaps before 2022. And so that would be my guess, that actually the biggest impact of the war would be in Ukraine. And of course, that speaks to the dilemmas that I think Russia finds itself in, having started a war on the thesis, as you said, that Russia and Ukraine were, if not the same country, at least part of the same history, as Putin set it out in his theses of the summer of 2021, ending up in a situation in which Ukrainians are more convinced than ever of the need to have two fully separate polities.
Thank you, Chris. It was a real pleasure, and I just want now to share this pleasure of communicating with you and talking to you with the rest of our audience. And Chris, the floor is yours now.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And if you have questions, I encourage you to put them in the Q&A box now. We have quite a few good questions in there, so make sure to get yours into the box, as it were. But let me start with a question. Serhii, you just asked your last question and said you weren't going to ask about the end of the war. I would like to ask about the end of the war, and in particular, about, in general, how, as historians, you're bringing your understanding of the ends of previous wars to this reality. Chris, you talked in the beginning about the change in military technology and how we have some of the old and some of the new working together. How are you seeing anything from the conclusions of previous conflicts that might be brought forward, and particularly, Serhii, with your deep research on Yalta, which was obviously a very different conflict. But how are you seeing that potentially giving us any insight into what might happen now with the efforts to bring this war to an end?
Serhii, would you like to go first?
So maybe let me jump in. I'll give you a few minutes of rest. Yes, Yalta, something that comes to mind very much so, and one of the reasons that was the conference that was condemned for the fact that the big three, the leaders of the great powers, were deciding the borders and the fate of the entire nations without really much consulting with them. drawing borders and sending millions of people east or west, lifting the entire Polish state from the map and moving it westward. And it looks like we are back to some form of the diplomacy between the great powers, where the smaller nations which are there to maybe either benefit or suffer the most are not included, are not at the negotiation table. And that's one reason to think about potential end of the post-World War II era and return to a much tougher world that really led to World War II and then contributed to the way how World War II ended. Another reason for concern is that Yalta Conference, despite the fact that it is perceived as spheres of influence conference, the American leader there, President Roosevelt, did everything in his power actually to preclude the division of the world into the spheres of influence. The Stalin and Churchill, who saw that as a model for the organization of the world, were forced to keep silent and actually keep secret from FDR the deal on the division of the Balkans that they concluded a few months earlier. So now it looks like no one is hiding these words from the American president of spheres of influence, but with this claims for Canada, for Panama, for Greenland, it looks like it's Western Hemisphere and extended Monroe Doctrine that was there before. And one more very concerning fact is that at Yalta, the Western powers trying to somehow do something good for the territories that were under the Soviet control, like Poland and Eastern Europe. What we are seeing today is that the interests of Ukraine that actually is waging the war, holding the line, and is not occupied, that those interests are being sacrificed. So all these comparisons between Yalta are one way or another really produce very negative connotations, and there can't be not just fair peace but lasting peace without Ukraine being really at the table as a major negotiator rather than a country that was informed about the decisions made somewhere else. So that's in terms of if a dangerous slippery slope of learning any lessons from history. But that's what if I forced to talk about lessons, those would be the lessons. The lessons of Yalta still stand today. No lasting peace without those who are involved and affected the most.
I think the other lesson that I might draw from history is the lesson from more recent history, which is the Minsk 1 and 2 negotiations that we saw in 2014 and 2015. And I think that the takeaway from those deals is that unless you address the root causes of a conflict, you should assume that it will start again in relatively short order. And it seems to me that the key conflict undergirding the current phase, but actually the last 15 years of Russian-Ukraine disputes is Ukraine an independent country or not? Russia thinks not really. Ukraine thinks yes. And that's a hard issue to have compromise on because it's fairly binary. And I think unless there's a resolution of that issue, any sort of temporary ceasefire is likely to be more temporary than ceasefire because the underlying issue isn't actually resolved. And so I do worry about ideas of declaring ceasefires without addressing the fundamental political issues, because I think we should be cognizant that they're not likely to last long unless the core issues are being addressed.
Thank you both. So we'll turn now to questions from our audience. And the first one here is, considering policy shifts in Washington, could you please speak to the nitty-gritty of Ukraine's military needs and Europe's ability to fund or meet those needs?
Sarah, do you want me to go
Well,
first, or would you like to go first?
Our webinar is advertised as the war through eyes of a historian. And Chris knows a lot that average historian doesn't know, from economics to technology. I don't know how much there is knowledge between two of us about what is happening directly on the front lines and what the needs are. But for me, that brings back the question about Europe being really a powerhouse, economic powerhouse. It's also a powerhouse in terms of the numbers of the population, sheer numbers of the population that are higher than the US, that are certainly much higher than in Russia. And it's the ability of Europe in this particular case to mobilize resources, and first of all, economic resources, to assure its own security. And the security of Europe is being fought over on the front lines in Ukraine. I think that the leaders of Europe today understand that. The question is to what degree they can do that. And when they're saying that the just European support of Ukraine is not enough, I disagree with that. It's certainly not enough if you consider the military equipment and ammunition and other things that are needed. Ukraine, as of today, is not capable of producing that. But as long as the US would be interested in supplying those for selling that, I think that Europe, even today, is capable of defending itself because it actually has an army in Ukraine that fights for its cause, and it has resources to support that army.
Well, I would agree that the key question does seem right now to be Europe's decisions about whether and how to support Ukraine, and also decisions about its own rearmament, both of which seem like there's been a shift in Europe over the past couple of months. But I think that the scale of that shift, as Serhii says, remains to be seen. But certainly, if you were looking at the simple question of could Europe afford to fund all of the support that Ukraine's been receiving the last couple of years, the answer is obviously yes. The question is, will it?
Thank you. A question was a little bit more about economics. When we speak of Moscow's motives and its current assault on Ukraine's sovereignty, have we been underestimating how much it has been driven by a desire to gain control over fresh economic rents, having consolidated control over all the key rents in Russia?
Well, I'm a skeptic that Russian foreign policy can be explained largely or really much at all in economic terms. I think it's true that taking control of rents has been an important part of the Russian political system and its structuring over the past several decades. But I also think that it's difficult to explain almost any of the key shifts in Russian foreign policy by either assuming that Putin is trying to maximize Russian GDP or his own access to resources. The Russia-Ukraine war was a very bad decision if you were solely looking to maximize Russia's wealth. It hasn't been in their interest at all. And I think the same is true of many of Russia's military adventures. There might have been individuals who have profited along the way, but on net, the best thing for Russia to have done economically, and the best thing I think for the Russian leadership to have done for their own personal wealth would have been to simply continue the existing energy relationship they had with Europe and continue siphoning funds off the top of that. So although economics is part of the calculus, I think it's far from a driving force in any of the key decisions that Russia's made about foreign policy. And that's where we have to turn to these broader questions of identity and empire in understanding Russian foreign policy.
Right. Another question, can you either of you speak to the factors that have allowed Ukraine to engage in so much technological innovation during the war as compared to Russia? Might this have to do with differences in military hierarchy, property rights, which we know leads to more investment and innovation, at least in theory, the quality of human capital, connections to the West, etc.?
Serhii, would you like to start?
Okay, sure. I can start. First of all, I would stress human capital, and in very, very general terms, I heard that from one of entrepreneurs, very successful entrepreneurs of Ukrainian background, who came from Ukraine, studied in the US, opened his very successful IT business. And he was explaining to my American colleagues of the why there is so much innovation, and he says, well, if an IT engineer is in the trenches and is being shot at, the IT engineer starts to think how he can protect himself and his friends and his colleagues, and he thinks in a particular way, and he comes up with a particular solutions. So it's the fact that the war is basically really was the war, especially during the first months, the war that was waged by volunteers coming from all walks of life and all professions, and Ukraine emerged before the start of the all-out invasion as one of the IT hubs of Europe. That certainly made an impact. And another thing, and as you see, I'm just referring to somebody else and someone whom I share their opinion. I'm not an expert on technology. So another opinion that I want to share with you came from a expert here from Boston area in technology and innovation in the military sphere, who recently visited Ukraine, and there were a lot of disappointments on many fronts, but there was just one thing that really was tremendously exciting for him, and this is the fact that so many things in organizational terms for those IT engineers and for those groups are possible in Ukraine that are probably impossible anywhere in the world, given the top-down structure and regulations that are there. And as he said, you have 18-year kids actually organizing and having support and being mobile and engaging in this warfare, where the red tape, either military or civilian or other, would preclude formation of that sort of units and that sort of flexibility and freedom that they have in operating. And a lot of that comes out of necessity, and a lot of that, of course, this lack of structure is a problem in other areas, but it also provides opportunity for the talent that Ukraine has, organize it in the way that is much more effective than is in the or exists, at least in his opinion, in the United States, and I guess probably in most of the world.
Chris, did you have anything to add?
I agree with that, and I think couldn't put it any better than Serhii just put it. So I have to go to the next question.
Great. Okay, well, this one's a little bit more directed to you, Chris. You started the conversation with talking about the persistence of old patterns of warfare alongside new high-tech warfare. And this questioner says, doesn't every conflict have high-tech warfare, given whatever the new technology is at the time? But as we look at the technological adaptations happening in this particular conflict, how should we think about this in the context of past military technological shifts?
I think the answer is first off, yes. Every conflict does have a mix of old and new, and I think some of the olds that persist are really quite striking. You know, one example, not in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, but in the in the U.S. military is that the B-52 airplane, which is now over 50 years of service, is expected to persist. I believe the latest numbers are to 100 years of service before it's finally retired in the middle of this century. So that's something that was once new that is now quite old and getting older. And I think there's many examples of that in defense contexts that you can think of. I think what stands out to me in this war is a couple of things. I think one is, as Serhii mentioned, you've got two countries at rough technological parity competing. So they have to be innovative to gain advantage. Second, the duration of the conflict is fairly long right now. And so there's been a long time horizon for innovation. And I think third, I think there is a confluence of technologies that are coming together, especially in the drone space, with communications, with falling costs of sensors, with early experiments in semi-autonomous action that are enabling a very rapid rate of innovation, both in terms of technological innovation and in terms of operational innovation than we've probably seen in other conflicts. And that combination of technological parity plus duration plus the specific evolution in the drone space does seem to have enabled a lot of rapid change, much more rapid than I think most people would have expected at the start of the conflict, and rapid enough that all of the other world's militaries are studying carefully what has happened to draw lessons from it.
Yeah, that crossed my mind as well, too. Now Ukraine has so much to offer to other nations who are thinking about their own militaries and how they can be competitive in this new world. What does the experience of the past 11 years suggest about the viability of continuing to rely on economic sanctions against large tyrannical regimes, which have increasingly taken steps to shield themselves against the worst impact of sanctions, or as you earlier put it, Chris, to hide where they're absorbing the financial impact of the conflict?
Well, I'm happy to start. I would say that relying on economic sanctions is probably not a good policy. I think using them still can be effective at cost imposition or at making it difficult for your adversary to build the military capabilities that they would like. I think if you would ask yourself, would the Russian military be stronger or weaker today if it had the unfettered access that it had before 2022 to the entire Japanese, European, American, Korean, Taiwanese industrial base? I think it's pretty hard to imagine that Russia would be in a worse position, and pretty easy to argue that these measures have made it much more difficult for them to source the capabilities that they need. Now, does that mean impossible? Certainly not. There are Chinese replacements for many types of products. You can smuggle them in. But I think the frequency with which Russian leaders talk about how much they would like sanctions to be lifted illustrates that they do indeed impose pretty significant costs on the Russian economy. That doesn't mean they're a silver bullet, a magic weapon, but I think we should also not err on the other side and say they're totally worthless when I think the cost imposition has been pretty substantial.
Yes, I agree. And one thing where sanctions are really not effective at all is in attempt short term to undermine the unity within particular countries or the stability of the regimes. So we're now looking at Iran, we're now looking at Russia. If the regimes are entrenched, the actually sanctions don't change much at all. But they really create significant difficulties for this acquiring military capabilities. As Chris said, I completely agree with that. And they play really long term. I think about Cold War as one just long period of sanctions, that eventually those sanctions contribute to what happens in the late 1980s. But again, that's a really time horizon that is measured in decades rather than in years.
Well, if if sanctions ultimately over time do lose a little bit of their impact, the idea that once a sanction is imposed, it's already lost some of its power, right? It's most useful when it's a threat, right? But is there a sense, and this is both just from your understanding of the current conflict, but also looking historically, of what might actually ultimately deter Russia? Is there anything that might make them sort of reconsider their approach so far, or as they're going into any kind of negotiation, particularly because they don't seem to mind making vague threats about nuclear war in a way that most other countries don't dare to do.
Serhii, would you like to start?
Sure. One reason why they're not making explicit threats to use nuclear weapons, my understanding is because these things are not viewed at positively, not only in the United States, but also in China and India. And relations with China in particular are essential for Russia's ability to continue this war, to continue economically and also technologically, but also politically in many ways as well. So what that means, that the influence that other countries, in particular China, can really exercise here, it's a very important factor in the war. We are in agreement that while politically it looks like Russia can continue inside of the country, continue the war indefinitely, producing more and more troops on the front line. Whether this is true or not, but it's certainly demonstrated that it is capable of doing that. It's incapable of waging economically war indefinitely. It's, as Chris said, very unhappy about sanctions, and this is the first desiderata that they have in terms of any sort of negotiations. And it is the weakest point now in terms of the Russian war machine and war effort. So anything that can ensure the continuation of the sanctions, tightening them, and support for Ukraine, that Ukraine would continue to fight again to a degree that Ukraine is prepared to do that. That's the way to the not just ceasefire, but maybe lasting peace. And returning also to what Chris said in the sense of the cause of this war, and that really, if you don't eliminate the cause, the war would continue. I look at this war as a historian as a war of the disintegration of empires, of the sort that other metropolis, other empires went through. And the only really remedy against imperialism and imperial thinking is a defeat. Defeat in those efforts, and realization that, again, economically, politically, and otherwise, that puts you and your country and your regime at the end in the worst place than where it started. So that's how I see what can influence Russia. In the short term, really a continuing economic pressure and the threat of the economic collapse. In the long term, one way or another, defeat somewhere in the post-Soviet space. Ukraine looks like one candidate to deliver that defeat, but maybe there can be other candidates in the future as well. Beyond that, if your neo-imperialism produces the result you expect them, if you emerge as the winner, what is the reason to change the script? What is the reason to behave differently?
Chris, any comments?
No, I think nothing to add. I agree with all of that.
Okay. We have a couple of questions that are about sort of information warfare and propaganda. The first question is just basically, what has been the role of information warfare and the impact in this particular conflict? And the second question related is, how do the speakers see the invasion of Ukraine in the context of the history of wartime propaganda? Thinking again about that question of historical change and what's kept and what's new.
Well, I would have two potential answers to that question. Serhii, I'd be interested in your views on looking at it less from a historical perspective, more from a present day perspective. My general view would be that actually we've probably overstated the impact of propaganda around the core debate of the war, the core driver of the war. And if my statement is correct that the core debate is whether or not Ukraine is an independent country, Russia thinks no, Ukraine thinks yes. I think we've seen tons of Russian information operations over the past 20 years to try to convince Ukrainians that they're not an independent country, independent people. And that effort has largely failed. You could say in certain cases on the margin has had an impact, perhaps so, but the direction of travel has been towards more support for an independent Ukrainian nation seen as something distinct from Russia than the opposite. And so if you step back at the strategic kind of level between Russia and Ukraine, have Russian information efforts worked? I think the answer is probably not, at least at their primary goal, which was to change minds in Ukraine. That hasn't succeeded. And I think going to the kind of historical perspective, that's not too surprising, given that I think one of the key lessons over the past 150 years is the extraordinary strength of nationalism as a mobilizing sentiment politically. And I think Ukraine is just one in a long string of countries that have found national identity, a powerful idea around which to mobilize a polity. And the fact that has been much more durable and powerful than the alternative that Russia is supplying via its TV channels and its social media accounts is not really a surprise when you look at the strength of nationality as a political idea or as a political organizing force in many other countries as well.
Yes, Chris, I agree with you, and most of what I see in the media is really concern or even panic about the successes of the Russian propaganda, and the White House or somebody else repeating the Russian narrative. The reality is that that propaganda certainly failed to demobilize Ukraine before 2022. It was very successful in 2014. It failed in 22. It certainly failed in good part of the Western world. Putin was so convinced that his military operation would be successful and would last only a few days that he didn't actually produce even a credible precedent, allegedly Ukraine attacking Russia, like Hitler did with Poland. So it was a blatant, unprovoked aggression, which was clear for the rest of the world, and Russian propaganda couldn't do much about that. Now, there is a big chunk of the world, the former Third World, the now maybe former Global South. We haven't come yet with a new title for that, but former post-colonial world where the Russian Empire or Russian Federation that is successor of the Russian Empire. Look at the territory. It's the largest state in the world. You don't acquire that territory unless you are an empire or used to be an empire. So this heir to the largest empire in the world, or one of the largest, is quite successful riding this wave of anti-imperialism, which is really anti-Westernism in many cases, against the rest of the world. And that brings me to the question, to what degree someone just repeats Russian narrative, or to what degree someone repeats those narratives because they're already explanation for things that, or justifications for things that particular leader or that particular country would do otherwise. And I think it's very important to distinguish between the two. The interests, how they're being constructed toward the key players in this conflict, in this war, versus the success of Russian propaganda. It is a very serious thing. It is very well funded, well oiled, but it can be defeated. It can be fought back, and Ukraine shows that.
Great, thank you. We've talked a lot about precedents, not surprisingly, as we're talking to historians, looking at the past to try and understand the present. Are there moments in the past which might be compared with the pace of the realignment that we're currently witnessing? Sometimes it can feel like we're living at a faster speed than past generations. Are there other points of change over time that could be compared to what we're seeing in the current moment?
I can start, Chris, if that's okay with you. Yeah, there are shifts and changes, but historically speaking, I don't see anything particularly extraordinary. Think about World War II, and the Russo-Ukrainian War is the largest, certainly, conflict in Europe since military conflict since World War II, potentially in the world. So comparisons are not completely out of order. So with World War II, the Soviet Union starts the war in September of 1939 on the side of Nazi Germany, and then emerges victorious on the side of Britain and United States. So that shifts in the alliances are something that happens in the major conflicts. I can go back to the 30-year war, which was very ideological, religious war, the way how it started, and then France switched sides from one camp, Catholic camp, to Protestant camp. So yeah, this things happened during the war. So it's nothing, historically speaking, nothing completely unusual in what is happening today. And I guess the question is mostly about the changing position of the United States in this war.
Chris, any extra thoughts?
I guess I would just agree that history seems like it's moving rapid when you're living through it.
Yeah. And
then when you look back at it and know what the outcome is, it seems like things were moving more slowly than they actually felt to people living through it at the time. Yeah. So I think we're in good company with historical figures and feeling like time is moving rapidly.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for this really, really thoughtful conversation. Any last thoughts or things we didn't get to today that you want to have final say?
Well, I would just thank the Davis Center and thank Serhii for the opportunity to join.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris.
Yes.
And Chris, thank you. So it was a pleasure. Thank you to the audience for the questions.
Thank you. Yes, thank you both for being here, and thank you for joining us today. The third webinar in our series will be held on Monday, April 7th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and will feature Eugene Finkel from Johns Hopkins University and Ivan Gomza from KSE discussing the strategic use of violence against citizens. We hope that you'll join us there, and we thank you again for joining us today. Take care.